So, good morning everyone, and may I welcome you to this panel event or symposium on the life and death of Eric Liddell and the rebirth of Chinese Christianity, which has been arranged as part of the Eric Liddell 100 programme, a series of events in Edinburgh and London and Paris and I think also Hong Kong to celebrate the centenary of his gold medal in the 400 metres at the Paris Olympics in 1924. It seems invidious to welcome particular people, as you are all welcome, but I do want to extend a particular welcome to one of Eric's nieces, Sue Caton. Sue, are you here? Special welcome to you. And in addition to that, I know that a number of people have travelled quite a significant distance to be here with us today. So a special welcome if you have come from north of the Highland Line to be with us in Edinburgh today. My name is Hugh Goddard, and I'm a member of the congregation at Christchurch Morningside, an Episcopal Anglican church on what is known locally in southwestern Edinburgh as Holy Corner, because of the presence of 4 different churches on each corner of the road junction. Christchurch is currently celebrating its sesquicentenary, or 150th anniversary, and it was there in the context of our Journeys in Faith seminar series, which normally meets once a month on a Sunday after church, that the idea for this event first took shape. It has grown a bit, though, from our normal custom of meeting on a Sunday morning, and we're very pleased, therefore, to be joined in the organisation of this event, first of all by our nearest neighbour on Holy Corner, Morningside United Church, as it was there that Liddell was a member in his student days back in the 1920s. And it was into the Scottish Congregational Union that Liddell was himself ordained in 1932. We're also very grateful to the Eric Liddell community for their support for the event and for incorporating it in the Eric Liddell 100 programme. And through their good offices, we're also very grateful to the University of Edinburgh and especially the principal, Professor Peter Matherton, for making this splendid venue available to us here in Old College. Saving me some embarrassment because we were originally thinking we might have an audience of about 40. The audience has grown a little bit since then, so we are very grateful for the availability of this venue. Now, the main focus of the EL 100, perfectly reasonably, is Eric's spectacular athletic and other sporting achievement, as memorably portrayed in the 1981 film Chariots of Fire. Some of us thought, though, that it's really important that his other great, indeed possibly greater interest, namely China, figure somewhere in the programme of events for the year. And we're really grateful to colleagues from across the University of Edinburgh for extending their working week onto a Saturday morning in order to enable us to do this. It's been a great pleasure to put the programme together, therefore, and we are assured, I think, of an interesting morning. Now, as our first speaker, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Brian Stanley. Brian is originally from Surrey. He was an undergraduate and then did his PhD in history at the University of Cambridge before moving to the University of Edinburgh in 2009 as director of the Centre for the Study of World Christianity, where he is now Professor Emeritus of World Christianity. Brian is the author of many articles and books, but just to highlight 2, his The World Missionary Conference, Edinburgh 1910, is the definitive study of a pivotal event in the history of Protestant mission in world Christianity. That was published by Eerdmans in 2009. And then his Christianity in the 20th Century, A World History, provides a masterly overview of the history of the Christian Church in all continents and in all its many branches in the period since then. That was published by Princeton University Press in 2018, now available in paperback. Excellent value, £25 for more than 500 pages. Brian, thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to your contribution on the last days of Eric Liddell and the last days of mission Christianity in China. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Hugh, for the kind introduction. And it's wonderful that we can meet in this splendid library as it used to be. It was a little over 100 years ago, on the 17th of July, 1924, that Eric Henry Liddell was awarded the ordinary degree, not honours degree, of Bachelor of Science at the University of Edinburgh graduation ceremony, not far from here in the McEwen Hall. If you look at his academic transcript in the university records, it's not particularly distinguished. One of his former schoolmasters at Eltham College, A.P. Cullen, who later became a colleague of Liddell's in the Anglo-Chinese College in Tianjin, described him, as schoolmasters often do, as a remarkable example of a man of average ability and talents, developing those talents to an amazing degree, and even appearing to acquire new talents from time to time through the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, despite his modest degree result, he was the star of the show at the ceremony. The principal, Vice-Chancellor, Sir Alfred Ewing, placed a wreath on his head made of oleaster sprigs, donated by the Royal Botanic Gardens, and gave him not just the usual degree certificate, but a special scroll extolling in classical Greek his achievements just 6 days previously in Paris as Olympic victor. Ewing's eulogy achieved heights of wit that every subsequent principal of the university must surely envy. Mr. Liddell, you have shown that none can pass you but the examiner. After the ceremony, Liddell's fellow students carried him through the streets of Edinburgh in triumph on a sedan chair, still wearing his oleaster wreath and clutching his scroll. No doubt Eric Liddell would be humbled and not a little surprised to find that a century later we in Edinburgh would be devoting a half-day conference to his memory. Perhaps he would be more surprised still to learn that our focus today is not on his extraordinary athletic achievements, but rather on his legacy in China, with particular relation to Christianity. So would we be remembering Eric Liddell today if he had not been a celebrated Olympic athlete and the subject of the movie Chariots of Fire? Almost certainly not. Born to missionary parents on the 16th of January 1902 in Xiaochang in Hebei province, Liddell's own missionary service in North China began in 1925 as a science and physical education teacher at the Anglo-Chinese College in Tianjin, one of the second batch of so-called treaty ports that the Western powers forcibly imposed on the Qing Empire following what we usually call the Opium Wars, the Anglo-Chinese Wars, one of the most painful episodes in Western Chinese relations. From late 1937, Liddell worked as a rural evangelist from his birthplace at Xiaochang. There can be no doubting his uncompromising spiritual dedication, but that could be said of many missionaries. The history of the London Missionary Society from 1895 to 1945 gives him only one brief mention in 640 pages. His published output was slight. He wrote 2 pamphlets published by Union Church in Tianjin, the expatriate congregation where Liddell and his future wife, Florence Mackenzie, worshipped. One was a set of notes for Sunday school teachers on the Sermon on the Mount, the other a collection of prayers for daily use by the church members. His only book was a devotional work on Christian discipleship, originally entitled A Manual of Christian Discipleship, which he circulated in manuscript form in the Japanese internment camp at Weixian, now Weifang, where he died of a brain tumour on the 21st of February 1945. Although Liddell hoped that the work would be translated into Chinese for the benefit of Chinese pastors, it said nothing about the cultural context of China, unless one counts a brief aside affirming that one side of righteousness is filial piety. In fact, the Manual on Discipleship would not be published in English until 1985 under the title The Disciplines of the Christian Life. Here it is. It's a fairly slight book in size. The hoped-for Chinese translation was eventually published in Hong Kong in 1988. Liddell was an intensely practical Christian, neither a theologian nor even a commentator on Chinese Christianity. So does he deserve a mention in the long and tangled history of Christianity in China? Does he make it even into a footnote? Within a few years of his untimely and tragic death, the Western missionary era in Chinese Christian history would similarly come to an abrupt and painful end. Should we therefore remember Liddell only as a heroic symbol of the now widely discredited missionary era, proof that it wasn't all bad? Or is there a bit more to be said? The starting point in answering that question might be a sentence written by a former China missionary, David Payton, of the CMS, the Church Missionary Society, in a very provocative book published in 1953, Christian Missions and the Judgment of God. Payton pulled no punches in his analysis of the fatal weakness of missionary Christianity in China. In a country which is being revolutionized by the invasion of the Western world, a Christian missionary who comes from the Western world, be he as harmless as a dove, as unpolitical as Jane Austen, is in himself, by his very existence, a political fact. Certainly, as a member of the missionary and expatriate community in Tianjin from 1925 to 1937, Eric Liddell was a political fact. He, and from 1934, his Canadian wife, Florence, daughter of Canadian missionaries, my wedding picture, lived in a substantial house located within the French concession in the city, one of several European territorial concessions located to the east and south of the old walled city. This is a map from a slightly earlier period, around the time of the Boxer Rising, but I don't think the geography had changed that much to 25 years later, so the French concession there. Their closest associates were other expatriates, whom they met on Sundays at the Union Church, during the week at the country club, the shops, the banks, the libraries built for the European residents. The Anglo-Chinese college, where Liddell taught, was, in effect, what we would call a middle school. Its Chinese name meant the Hall of New Learning. New means Western, the Hall of Western Learning. The aim of the college was to provide an English language education to the more modern educated Chinese, with a particular emphasis on the benefits derived from healthy sports, hence Liddell. Its founder and principal from the 1890s until 1928, or actually slightly later, until 1930, I think, was Dr. S. Lavington Hart, a former fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. The elaborate Gothic buildings of the Anglo-Chinese College were styled on the model of St. John's in Cambridge, and those of you who know Cambridge may recognise the resemblance. Hart was extremely proud of the Anglo-Chinese College's British origins and British cultural identity. But from 1925, the year Liddell joined the staff, these characteristics came under increasingly fierce challenge from the nationalist anti-Christian movement that was sweeping through Chinese educational establishments. As for price for registration from the nationalist government, the college had to dilute its Christian character. Hart was compelled to resign in 1930. The college had to report to the government's Chinese Educational Bureau on whether its staff had been trained according to Kuomintang's 3 principles of the people: nationalism, popular sovereignty, and the people's livelihood. By 1934, Liddell had to report to the London Missionary Society that in all Christian educational institutions, compulsory religious education had been replaced by compulsory military training conducted by Chinese sergeants. It's not surprising, therefore, that Liddell soon concluded that the college was, in the words of one obituary, not to be his life. However, his relocation to Xiaochang, where his parents had worked, where he was born, where his brother Robert also worked as a doctor for the LMS, that relocation was made at the Society's request, and indeed Liddell was initially resistant. One of the reasons for his resistance was that he was not fluent enough in Chinese. I don't think there'd been much opportunity to speak Chinese in the Anglo-Chinese College. Yet, within 6 months of arriving in Xiaochang, his Chinese improved markedly. He soon found that the work of evangelism among the illiterate people of this remote part of Hubei province gave him, he said, more joy and freedom in the work than I have ever experienced before, even though the area was part of the Japanese-controlled part of North China. Cycling around the country villages in the company of a Chinese evangelist and interpreter, Wang Fengzhou, Liddell developed a fraternal relationship with the local population in a way that would never have been possible in the foreign enclave in Tianjin. He was given the same Chinese honorific title as his father, Li Muxi, Pastor Li. The veneration in which he was now held came not from his distant triumph in the Paris Olympics, which meant little to the villagers, but from his local lineage and his personal humility. Like many other missionaries before him, he owed his entry into China ultimately to the false security provided by the European powers and their treaty ports. The real China was now beginning to gain an entry into Liddell's heart and mind. The mission buildings at Xiaochang, along with 50 village churches, had been destroyed in the Boxer Rising of 1900 to 1901. But the Chinese staff had rebuilt the compound, and over the entrance gate had displayed a sign that read in Chinese characters, "Chinese and foreigners, all one home." That sign could never have been affixed to the entrance to the Anglo-Chinese College. Liddell's work in Xiaochang was brought to a premature close in 1941 by the consolidation of Japanese occupation of North China. With his wife and growing family, he had to return to the comparative, though fragile, security of Tianjin. Soon, Florence and the two girls, plus another one on the way, left for the greater security of Toronto, Canada. Eric never saw them again. His final years were spent not simply in enforced separation from his wife and 3 daughters, but also in enforced separation from the Chinese he had come to love. The artificiality of a gated life within the European settlement in Tianjin gave way in March 1943 to the more absolute isolation of the Japanese internment camp at Weixian in Shandong province, the largest Japanese internment camp in China. The last 2 years of his life were thus spent in the company of Europeans, Americans, and Japanese guards. He saw no Chinese, other than the dealers who could be seen beyond the walls of a camp seeking clandestine opportunities to sell or barter their wares with the internees. Liddell was in China, but China was outside the walls. We are bound to ask, therefore, whether there is any connection at all between the last days of Eric Liddell and the turbulent course of Christianity in China over the next few decades. The answer of the honest historian, and I hope I am one, must be not much. His official commemoration in China is typically merged with a celebration of the liberation of the Weixian camp from Japanese rule by Chinese forces in 1945. This was notably the case at various commemorative events held in Weifang in 1991, 1995, 2005, and 2015. The Chinese government insists that he should be remembered as a teacher of fraternal values, not as a missionary of a foreign religion. The text, inscribed on the granite stele donated by the University of Edinburgh at the 1991 event, had to make that clear. He embodied fraternal virtues. Well, yes, but there's more to be said. Nevertheless, perhaps I can suggest a few reflections in the final part of this talk that may not be wholly irrelevant. One of his fellow internees was another Scottish missionary of the London Missionary Society, a diminutive nurse from Peterhead, Annie Gray Buchan. She had come to know and revere Liddell in Xiaochang, where she worked in the mission hospital. Her personal papers, now thankfully preserved within the Centre for Research Collections in the main library of the university in George Square, afford us the fullest and most poignant descriptions of the final months of Eric's life. Some of the recent popular biographies contain extracts from her account of how Eric devoted his vanishing energies to caring for internees in a worse condition even than himself. And I'll only give you 1 or 2 brief extracts. You can read the biographies for yourself. He helped to make the briquettes of coal dust mixed with earth that the internees used in an attempt to keep themselves warm. Despite the cost to his own fragile health, his brain tumour was undiagnosed, he also carried the coal, chopped the wood, carried the water buckets to the dormitories, and queued for food on behalf of those who were too weak to do it for themselves. His failing was, says Buchan, in prose that is as moving as it is ungrammatical, his failing was he never refused, and losing weight and strength, people accepted it. Eric always gave his best, and it could be seen that he had an inner strength and determination to try if it would help. He was quiet. He lived his Christianity, to follow in the footsteps of his master, who the people said of him, he went about doing good. Buchan was on night duty in the camp hospital when Liddell was brought in, and was at his bedside when he died on the 21st of February 1945. As I'm sure many of you know, she records his last words as its complete surrender. She comments, he whose rule of life was surrender of self to a higher purpose found it easy when the end came to hand over his sword in full surrender to the God he loved and served. Buchan's portrait of Liddell is of a Christian who allowed the consistency and humility of his own life to do the talking. He was quiet. It is a portrait of a disciple of Jesus Christ. In the last decade of his life, Liddell became absorbed with the message of the Sermon on the Mount. The sermon was the subject of his first publication, the Notes for Sunday School Teachers, published in Tianjin in 1936 or 7. It also has a prominent place in the disciplines of the Christian life. The sermon in Matthew chapter 5, in particular, also featured regularly in the biblical instruction that Uncle Eric regularly gave in the internment camp to the over 300 missionary children from the China Inland Missions School at Chifu, who were placed in the camp in late 1943. Liddell's fascination with the Sermon on the Mount seems to have derived from his reading of the book by E. Stanley Jones, The Christ of the Mount, A Working Philosophy of Life, published in 1931. Reading Christ on the Mount inspired Liddell to write both his Notes for Sunday School Teachers and then his Manual of Christian Discipleship. Jones was a celebrated American Methodist missionary in India, friend and biographer of Gandhi, who was himself, of course, also an enthusiastic exponent of the Sermon on the Mount as an ethical handbook for living for Hindus as well as Christians. Jones was also a passionate believer in the need for Christianity to become indigenized, as the picture perhaps suggests. In his book on the Sermon on the Mount, Jones applied Christ's teaching to contemporary issues of racial and imperial politics. I'm going to give you his pungent commentary on Christ's words in Matthew 5, verse 22, with apologies for his use of the N-word. He that says to his Eastern brother, native, Chinaman, Jap, shall be in danger of the council of collective opinion, a growing moral sentiment, and if he goes too far, he will find himself in the fires of rebellion. He that says to his brother, nigger, shall be in danger of the council of growing collective judgment, and he who says, thou fool, shall be in danger of the hell of fire, of seeing the Negro surpass him in intellectual and moral character. Thou fool comes back with terrific and terrifying force. You murder the soul of another, and the ghost of his spirit haunts your councils, your national legislatures, and your very national life. We cannot know whether Liddell marked those words in what became his tattered copy of Jones's book, though I like to imagine that he did. The Christ of the Mount was one of the few books he was able to take with him into the internment camp. He regularly gave public readings from it alongside the Sermon on the Mount to internees. A particular favourite was Christ's injunction to love one's enemies. In the disciplines of the Christian life, Liddell strongly commended Jones's book in these terms. I have come to the conclusion that what we call the Sermon on the Mount is the way a Christian will act, that it constitutes the technique of being a Christian. It is his working philosophy of life. Notice the allusion to Jones' subtitle. Annie Buchan reflected on the enforced missionary exodus from China in her letter of resignation from the London Missionary Society in July 1951, wrote, "On looking back, I cannot accept that what would appear on the surface to be disaster can mean failure." Had Eric Liddell lived to see the communist victory, I suspect he would have reached a similar conclusion. His own life in China until 1941 followed a trajectory that can be said to replicate in miniature the course that Christianity in modern Chinese history has taken. From being one of a comparatively ineffective group of missionaries, doing good educational work, no doubt, but within the treaty pockets of European influence and culture, he had become a witness of ordinary Chinese people in a remote location espousing Christianity in their own way. I believe Eric Liddell would have viewed that larger and more recent transition of Chinese Christianity on a national scale with approval. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Brian, for doing such a good job of putting Eric Liddell's work in its context, as well as taking us through the different stages of that career, and of course, very movingly, his final days in the internment camp. If you'd like to know more about that broader context, Brian has an article entitled Edinburgh and China, the History of Medical, Educational and Missionary Connections in the University of Edinburgh Journal for 2021. This is quite difficult to find, but I have a PDF of the article. If anybody would be interested in that, have a word with me afterwards. Now, as Brian has reminded us, things changed a lot in China in 1949. But Christianity is not only relevant to China itself, but to Chinese diaspora communities as well, both in East Asia and also, of course, the wider world as well. Muslim majority countries such as Malaysia and Indonesia have significant Chinese Christian communities. But our next presentation is in a sense a mirror image of the first, not focusing on Liddell as a missionary travelling to China, but rather on the establishment of Chinese Christian communities in other parts of the world, including the West. It's my pleasure, therefore, to welcome as our next speaker, Dr. Alexander Chow. Alex is originally from California. He did his PhD in theology in the University of Birmingham and came to the University of Edinburgh in 2013, where he's now co-director of the Centre for the Study of World Christianity. He's written widely on Chinese Christian theology and on the understanding of Christianity more widely in China. But today, he's going to address another of his research interests, Chinese Christianity among the New Scots. Alex, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for that introduction, and thank you also, Brian, for your paper. I'm glad to be able to give my presentation, which, as Hugh suggested, is a mirror image to the events of Eric Liddell in China, and is to focus our attention on the development of Chinese Christianity here in Scotland. And I've decided to use the language in my presentation of New Scots. And that's a particularly interesting term by itself, because in the last 2 decades, the Scottish Parliament has used the term, in particular, to talk about immigration to Scotland, and in particular, the labor force that immigration brings, but also in reference to refugees. But the term New Scots has a larger life, if you will, than the Parliament, the Scottish Parliament. It's been around for a while, and it's a term that talks more broadly about immigration into Scotland since the end of World War II. Now, before we speak about Chinese Christians among New Scots, it's worth saying that prior to the 20th century, there were very few Chinese in Scotland at all. Most books on British Chinese history record a handful of early visitors to England. Most notably, the Jesuit Michael Shenfuzong, who was entertained in the court of King James II in 1685, or John Antony, who came under the auspices of the East India Company in 1799 and managed accommodations for Chinese and Indian seamen in London. The latter, John Antony, even pursued an act of parliament in 1805 to be naturalized a British citizen. He did so because he wanted to own property. And you couldn't own property if you weren't a Brit. And so in 1805, after much personal cost to himself, he finally became naturalized as a British citizen. Within a few months, he died. Now, these two men, of course, as I mentioned, are focused on England. But when we turn to Scotland, there are 2 other interesting figures worth remembering. The first is a man by the name of William Macau, who has recently been written about by a man named Barclay Price. Macau came to the Scottish Highlands in the 1770s as a servant to a returning East India Company medical doctor, David Urquhart. He was baptized around 1778 in the local Church of Scotland, parish church in Rosolis, in Ross, and later moved to Edinburgh. And here in Edinburgh, he worked for 50 years as an accountant for the Board of Excise. And he served, beginning in 1807, for a dozen years as church elder at Rose Street Burger Church. Coincidentally, 1807 happens to be the same year that the Anglo-Scot Robert Morrison traveled the other direction, if you will, from London through the United States and eventually to Macau and Canton, pioneering the modern Protestant mission to China. Barclay Price describes William Macau as the first Chinese Scotsman. This is because in 1818, William Macau naturalized with Scottish citizenship, not British citizenship. And the reason was due to a technicality of owning stock in the Bank of Scotland that he got this citizenship. Now, the other person worth mentioning is Wang Feng, the first Chinese to study in a European university. Wang Feng was a native of Canton, and he first studied in a school established in the neighboring Macau by Robert Morrison, the same Anglo-Scot I mentioned earlier. Wang later studied in the US and then, with the support of the Edinburgh Medical Mission Society, came to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine in 1850. That's his dissertation that you could download from the university website today if you like. It's all in handwritten back then, of course. He finished it in 1855 and returned to Canton, where he worked at the Canton Missionary Hospital and became the first Chinese customs medical officer in the region. Now, if we consider these two early Chinese Christians in Scotland, it offers us some valuable considerations. First, the two represent some of the major reasons why Chinese have come to Scotland over the years, for work and for education. They both sought a better life, and the Christians and Christianity they encountered were instrumental in their biographies, in their conversions, in their educations, and in their vocations. But how were they perceived in Scotland? Both had strong English skills and roles in their respective professional careers as an accountant and as a medical doctor. But they are always recognized as being Chinese. See, for instance, the memoir of the Edinburgh town clerk, James Laurie, who writes, 40 or 50 years ago, there was a Chinese gentleman in the excise office in Edinburgh by the name of William McCow. In his latter days, he was slightly made, little old man, with a glazed yellow face and the regular Chinese eyes. This was the first Chinese Scotsman. He was a Scottish citizen, but he was always known because he was Chinese. Now, these two men straddled the defining historic moment in Sino-British history that Brian mentioned, that is, the Opium Wars. We must remember that William McCow came to Scotland as a servant of a medical doctor of the East India Company. This is the same East India Company that had a massive commercial interest in the Indian subcontinent and was beginning to turn to China because China had precious products such as porcelain, silk, and tea. But getting to China wasn't easy, and part of the way was through the Portuguese colony of Macau. Today, we know that British tea is quintessential British. It is found in the cupboard of every British household. But during the time of William McCow, tea, of course, was secured under lock and key because it was such a precious commodity. This cost quite a penny because the only thing the Brits had that the Chinese wanted was silver. And that is until the East India Company started cultivating opium in Bengal. The Chinese government prohibited opium, but the British merchants illegally used it for trade with Chinese merchants, what we would today call international drug smuggling. It is ironic that in the UK, opium was often associated with the debased morality found amongst Chinese in Chinatowns. Yet it was the British merchants who were pushing opium on the Chinese. In 1839, when a large shipment of illegal opium was being smuggled into China by the British merchants, the Chinese government seized it and destroyed the whole lot. The British government responded by starting a war. China's loss forced open 5 treaty ports and ceded a little fishing village known as Fragrant Harbor, better known in English as Hong Kong. This secured British commercial interests in China for over a century and a half, but it also allowed Christianity to enter China, the Chinese mainland. Now, before the Opium Wars, Robert Morrison was only able to operate his mission in a small trading outpost in Canton and Macau. Later, Protestant, Catholic, and Russian Orthodox missionaries all benefited from so-called unequal treaties that came after the First Opium War. In Chinese historiography, the Opium Wars began the so-called Century of Humiliation. That century ended with China joining the UN Security Council in 1945 and the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. It's for this reason that Christianity, even until today, has often been associated with foreign imperialism. This was a time in which Christianity was described in China as Yangjiao, foreign religion, but literally meaning the religion of the ocean. That is where the imperialists came from. This also led to a crisis in modernity, and China sent students abroad, and many came to Edinburgh to study medicine, like Wang Feng. Like Wang, many were already exposed to Christianity through mission schools and were connected in the UK to student networks, like the Chinese Student Christian Union in Great Britain and Ireland. The Opium Wars also led to an economic crisis in China. Many Chinese, especially from the Cantonese region of Seyup, took up hard labor jobs as coolie workers, or in Mandarin, coolie. Some went to North America to work the gold mines, and others came and worked as seamen on the British ships, and later the merchant navy during the 2 world wars. We know that Chinese seamen ran ships that docked in Glasgow. But unlike the Liverpool docks, which developed a settled community and the first Chinese church in 1910, few Chinese seamen seem to settle in Glasgow or Scotland in general. This is also why the greatest tragedy of British-Chinese history happened in Liverpool, when 1,300 settled Chinese were illegally rounded up and deported by the Home Office, many leaving behind wives and children who didn't know what happened. Nothing like this happened, of course, in Glasgow, because there was no settled community. But both these groups, the students and the seamen, were transient populations in Scotland. This changed after World War II. But why after the war? The answer is Chinese food. It so happened that in the post-war period, this was when the wider British population began to have more expendable cash and a more adventurous spirit to try out Chinese food. This would be the start of a Chinese catering boom. But whereas prior to the Second World War, in Britain's Chinatowns, you could find Chinese restaurants, but which had more regional tastes for Chinese to consume. In the later period is a new innovation, if you will, of British Chinese food to suit British palates. And during this period, there were also Chinese students and nurses who migrated to the UK from Hong Kong, Malaya or Malaysia and Singapore. But by 1985, a whopping 90% of the British Chinese were employed in the catering business. 90%. Now, why did the Chinese come to Britain in the first place? Now, after the Second World War, the British government issued a series of acts between 1948 and 1981 that opened immigration for those born in colonies such as Hong Kong and Malaya. Amongst British Afro-Caribbeans, this period is known as the Windrush generation, and you may have heard of this term before. Now, importantly, the British Nationality Act of 1948 defined British nationality through the creation of a new status of citizen of the United Kingdom and the colonies. This is important because these are British nationals, not just Chinese or Afro-Caribbeans. Alongside Chinese from former colonies, others came fleeing the communist revolution from mainland China through the new territories into Hong Kong and then over to the UK. Excuse me. And still others were fleeing war-torn Vietnam. In the 1980s, there was also a growing number of mainland Chinese students, something that we still see today here in Edinburgh. In 1984, the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and the Chinese Premier, Zhao Ziyang, signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. This signaled Hong Kong would eventually return to China in 1997. Then the Hong Kong Act of 1985 established a new category of British nationality known as British National Overseas. While some Hong Kongese began to leave Hong Kong to places like the UK in the mid-1980s, after the 1989 clash in Tiananmen Square, the migration grew quite significantly. Now, this major wave of Hong Kongese were culturally different from the earlier waves of Chinese migrants. Furthermore, by the 1990s, you also have the development of second and third generation SBCs, Scottish-born Chinese, who are increasingly bicultural, if you will. Now, it's worth stating that a good number of the Chinese first moved to England before relocating to Scotland. This was partially particularly true in the catering business, since you can't really open a Chinese takeaway next to another Chinese takeaway. And so in order to avoid competition and to look for different employment opportunities, many who had originally come to England resettled in Scotland. It also means that the British Chinese have been the most geographically spread, dispersed ethnic population in the UK. Now, the vast majority of Chinese in Scotland were not exposed to Christianity prior to coming to the UK. One major exception is those from the New Territories island of Ngap Zhao or Robson Island. This island was an enclave for Christians associated with a group known as the True Jesus Church, a Chinese Pentecostal denomination originally established in Beijing in 1917. In the 1970s, a number of Chinese restaurants and takeaways in Scotland, especially in Edinburgh and Elgin, just outside of Aberdeen, were run by families having one of 9 surnames and associated with this Chinese Pentecostal group because of chain migration. In Edinburgh alone, there are 2 True Jesus churches, one not far from here in Gifford Park and another in Stockbridge. Now, aside from the True Jesus Church, the growth of British Chinese Christianity is largely associated with the work of people like Stephen Wong and Frank Zheng, who are based in London and Birmingham, respectively. Wong started the Chinese Overseas Christian Mission in 1951, and the 2 of them traveled throughout the country, including to Scotland in the 1960s and 1970s, to evangelize the Chinese they encountered. Eventually, Chinese fellowships were created in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Aberdeen. And by the turn of the century, Chinese churches were established in each of these 3 cities. None of these churches are associated with any denomination, but all have a loose connection with Wong's Chinese Overseas Christian Mission. In recent years, I probably don't need to tell you that we have entered a new period due to the recent social political unrest in Hong Kong, connected to protests related to the umbrella movement in 2014 and opposing the amendment in the extradition law in 2019 and 20. The Beijing and Hong Kong governments have since declared the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration was no longer legally binding. This meant that the 50-year protection of the Joint Declaration around civil liberties and the region's capitalist economy were now in jeopardy. In response, British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab in 2021 stated that, quote, "The UK considers Beijing to be in a state of ongoing non-compliance with the Joint Declaration." And the Home Office created a new visa route in 2021 for Hong Kong BNO passport holders. This recent influx of Hong Kongese translates to a phenomenal growth of British Chinese population. 1 out of every 4 to 5 Chinese you meet on the streets is probably recently from Hong Kong. Furthermore, these are British nationals, of course, British nationals overseas. And whilst some have come directly from Hong Kong to Scotland, many, like earlier waves, first moved to England, but have relocated to Scotland. This time, it's because cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester have had so many Hong Kongese moving there that it creates competition for housing and school catchments. So they look elsewhere, including in Scotland. Of these new Hong Kongese immigrants, some 20 to 25% are Christians. Now, mind you, this figure is higher than the percentage of Chinese Christians before this migration in both the UK and in Hong Kong. So it's a particular demographic that is moving over. And in part, this has resulted in the proliferation of even more newer Hong Kongese churches in Scotland. Recently, I led a study where we identified different immigration populations in Christianity in Edinburgh. And in this study, we identified 7 major Chinese congregations now in the city of Edinburgh. But that doesn't include the growing number of Hong Kongese fellowships and small groups in historic Scottish churches, Church of Scotland, Scottish Episcopal, Baptist, Roman Catholic, and so forth. This is an important difference from before this period, when historic Scottish churches, frankly, had little interest in the Chinese. Only time will tell how New Scots and Old Scots continue to relate over time in the wider society as well as in churches. Now, as I conclude, we cannot forget that this most recent migration wave began amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if you thought that the lockdown situation was difficult, try leaving your home, moving to a new country, and operating in a second language. That is tough. Many of these church communities that I just mentioned have been actually quite important because they have provided social and practical support for these new migrants. One of these churches that I know of has even produced YouTube videos on places to live and shops to go to and the practical livings in Edinburgh that have been distributed quite widely. So these churches have provided social and practical support to these new migrants. But mind you, this is also the same period of COVID-19 in which the virus was also called the China virus. And in the UK recorded an unprecedented rise in anti-Chinese racism. Now, secondly, while Chinese Christians are New Scots, many have long been legally classified as British nationals. Regardless of legal status, Chinese have been shaping Britain even from before the Opium Wars, from British tea and British Chinese takeaways to contributions in the wider British society and culture. Finally, it's worth saying that we are in a historic moment when there's recordings of a tremendous decline in historic British Christianity. And that is juxtaposed against the rise amongst New Scots who are Christians. These New Scots should not simply be seen as foreigners in this land, but part of Scottish Christianity. New Scots are reconfiguring New Scottish Christianity. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex, for giving us such a good insight into that mirror image of the relationship between Christianity in the West and Christianity in China. And there is a seminar coming up in New College on Tuesday, which will provide a little bit further detail about this. So have a word with Alex over coffee if you'd like more details about that. This is a talk by Dr. Xinjuan Huang of the British and Foreign Bible Society on the Chinese community in Britain, spirituality, dynamics, and division.